So I'm going to go ahead and introduce LJ. Honestly, LJ probably doesn't need an introduction for our center. I don't know if LJ know this, but we actually were introduced to some of their work many years ago when we had Ujuanya visit our campus, and we read Diversifying Language Educators and Learners in preparation for that. So if I'm quite transparent and honest, you're probably surrounded by fans, LJ. And so it is a welcoming and exciting group of folks that have been looking forward to having you with us. So LJ Randolph Jr., EDD, is an associate professor of Spanish and education and coordinator of the World Language Teacher Education Program at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. He teaches courses in Spanish language, contemporary Latino, Latino, Latinx, Latina cultures, and second language teaching methods. His research focuses on various critical issues in language education, including teaching Spanish to heritage and native speakers and incorporating justice-oriented and anti-colonial pedagogies. Dr. Randolph is a co-editor of the forthcoming book, How We Take Action, Social Justice in the K through 16 Classrooms. He is a past president of FLANC and AATSP-NC, and he currently serves on the ACFO board of directors. It is no exaggeration when I say we are honored and thankful for your presence here at our center. So without further ado, I will let LJ take over.
Wow, thank you for that very wonderful introduction. And I am also very happy to connect with the folks at Click again. I enjoyed the last time that I was able to give a more complete workshop. And, you know, with this talk, hopefully we'll delve more deeply into some of the themes that I mentioned the last time I was here. Hopefully we'll be able to have some conversations at the end of the presentation. So give me 1 second here, make sure I have my computer ready. I have several monitors here so I can see all of your faces and also see my presentation. So okay. Are we able to see the presentation? Yeah, all right, great. Make sure I selected the correct monitor and everything. Wonderful. And also, this presentation has a little bit of sound in it, and so I want to make sure that that works. So I'll play part of this video clip to make sure that I set up everything correctly.
Quiero contarle, mi hermano, un pedacito de la historia negra, de la historia nuestra, caballero, y dice así.
Okay, great. So I saw some thumbs up, so I won't play the entire video. And there's another point where we watch a video, so just wanted to make sure that that works. And so what I want to talk to you today about, sort of under the umbrella of justice-oriented pedagogies and inclusive pedagogies, is looking specifically at some ideas and research relating to anti-racist and anti-colonial approaches to language learning. I believe this is being recorded, and also if you want access to any of the slides that I shared during this presentation, you'll be able to do that at the tinyurl link that you see there. It's just tinyurl.com/click2022. And then also feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or ideas even. I love hearing ideas and different ways that people are thinking about some of the topics that, that we discussed in this presentation. And so I have my contact information there. I'm changing institutions, and so I don't have my UNCW email there, although that email still works. However, I don't know, I guess sometime in June, it will no longer work. I'm moving to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and so that's where I'll be starting in the fall of this year. So some of the essential questions that I want to look at are how have races and colonial ideologies influenced our profession? How might we intentionally implement anti-racist and anti-colonial pedagogies while also building students' language proficiency? So realizing that it's not an either or something that we do in addition to, but we can meet those goals concurrently. How do we establish and maintain effective classroom communities? And we'll talk at the end about how might we overcome some of the challenges associated with this type of work. I always begin, I know some of you I've seen before, but I always do like to begin by talking about my positionality and the bias that I bring to this work. I think we all bring biases and our own ideologies that have been shaped by our experiences and our beliefs. And so I want to share a little bit about my own. I don't think any of us can really consider ourselves to be an objective voice. And so my journey with language learning began when I was in high school in the 10th grade. I took a Spanish class, and although language learning was a generally positive experience, I felt that Spanish was definitely a quote unquote foreign language in every sense of the word. I didn't talk to people who spoke Spanish. I didn't know anyone who was Spanish or even bilingual or multilingual. And the ironic thing about it was this was in the late 90s in North Carolina, and North Carolina was a new gateway state for immigration at that time. And there were several people from Spanish-speaking communities moving into their new community and the community that I was living in. And so there were people who spoke Spanish all over the place, people from Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and other Central American countries mainly. But I never saw them in my daily experience in school. They weren't in any of my classes. I wasn't friends with any of them. And we didn't really make that connection in the classroom. There didn't seem to be a community connection to learning Spanish. It didn't seem like a community language. It seemed like something that people spoke far off and away. Also, I subconsciously, I knew, I guess, that Black people spoke Spanish, but I never saw evidence of that in the curriculum materials that we used or in the discussions that we had. And so my interest really, fast forward to college, when I really started to learn more about the diversity within the Spanish-speaking world, and realizing that there were communities of Black people who spoke Spanish all over the world, really, and that no matter what your identity was, there's this sort of shared history and this shared experience with people who spoke the language that we're being studied. And I know that no matter what language you teach, there is that shared history with at least some of the experiences and the histories of your students. And I really wanted my students to know that and to see that, and for it to be blatantly obvious to them, even in the early years of their language study. So even in like Spanish 1, I taught high school for 10 years before coming to the university, and that was really a goal of mine. And so when I think about the way that I approach language learning, that's always something that's at the forefront. How can I connect this to the cultures that the students already value in their own lives, the language identities, the cultural identities, et cetera, the histories of their families and their cultures? What connections exist, and how can we create that unifying and shared and empowering experience when we engage in language study? What we're going to talk about today is only a piece of what social justice looks like in education. I have here sort of, when I think of social justice, and off the top of my head, if I was thinking about, well, what are all the other theories in education, not just in language education, but just in education in general, that relate to justice-oriented pedagogies? There's a lot. Social justice plays nice, I would say, with a lot of different theories. And I'm not going to go through these, so don't worry. But just in case people don't know, ICC there just didn't have space to write out loud. That's intercultural communicative competence, Michael Byram, if you want to read more about that. And then you can see there all the other elements elements, and this is a non-inclusive list, by the way, that relate to justice-oriented pedagogies. And so what I'm doing today really is only part of this. It's just one way, not the only way, that we might think about justice-oriented pedagogies, because I know that you all are having a whole series of speakers, and I imagine that people are focusing on different elements and different strategies and different ways of thinking about how to enact this in the language classroom. So that being said, there are parts of that framework that I want to pull out and focus on so that we're clear on what I mean when I say these things. So when I talk about critical pedagogies, generally speaking, I'm talking about any classroom practice that addresses difference, power, or social stratification in the classroom or in the world. When I think about something being justice-oriented, again, you can do a whole presentation just on that, right? But equitable distribution of power, tangible and intangible resources, benefits. I always like to focus on this idea of mattering in the classroom and in society, like you're valued and important enough to be seen and to be heard in the classroom, both literally in terms of physical bodies in the classroom and figuratively in terms of the thematic elements that we address in the classroom. And those of you who read Uju's in my article on diversifying language education, that was a big piece of that. Anti-racist, I think of that in the language classroom as actively combating the erasure, the violence, the marginalization, the discrimination of minoritized racial groups, and doing that in such a way that uplifts and celebrates the liberation efforts of those very communities. And anti-colonial, in the case of Spanish, in the context that I teach it, a lot of this is context driven. So anti-colonial will mean something different for different languages and different contexts. But in my particular context, I focus a lot on combating Eurocentric and colonial ideologies that have set the status quo for our institutions and the way that we view languages. I love Kishimoto's definition here of anti-racist pedagogy. I'm not going to read the whole thing word for word, but I did include the whole text because I wanted you to see it in context. But one thing that I like that she focuses on is that it's not just about our courses, our curriculum, and our discipline, but it really is about how we teach. And even if your course doesn't claim to involve race at all, I think if you dig deeply enough, it does. Even if outside of language, like something like physics or something like that, you'll see races and colonial influences in those fields as well. But just thinking about it, not only in the context of the classroom, but in the broader context outside of the classroom and in society. So again, context driven and thinking about my own language, Spanish, what are some ways that we've seen evidence of racist and colonial pedagogies in the teaching of Spanish? And I have a few examples of that. So the first is if you go to Amazon and you type Spanish dictionary or something like that, this is what comes up. Either references to Spain or if it outside of Spain, you get these very stereotyped, egregious representations of people who speak the language, like you can see there in that Spanish workbook, which is at the far right end of that list. The way that we organize our courses, this might be difficult to read, but I wanted to include the descriptions here. This is just a clip of the advanced culture and literature classes that we offer at my current institution. So you can see there it's divided based on, is it Spain or is it someone else? So we have Spanish civilization and Spanish literature, and we have Spanish American civilization and Spanish American literature, as if all of Spanish speaking Latin America is comparable to Spain in terms of artistic production and value of the history and the literature of those cultures. We see it in the way that we view and teach history. So if you're a Spanish teacher, you might have noticed this on the left here. That's La Noche Triste, the sad night, which is when the Aztecs were able to win a battle against Cortes and his men. However, in history, we call it the sad night because history is written by the victors, right? And when I was in Mexico over the summer, there's this movement to have folks, this was last summer of 2021, which is the 500th anniversary of what we know in history as the Spanish conquest. And so as an act of rebellion and trying to get people to rethink that, you'll see these banners that talk about 500 years of indigenous resistance, and just recognizing that it was a war. It was not a conquest, as if Spain came over and conquered indigenous communities as if that was their destiny. And then we see it in some of our, what I call our faves of the profession. And so this is a quote by Simón Bolívar, who is thought of as kind of like the George Washington of Latin America. And George Washington is also problematic too, right? But you can see here his thoughts on the first president of Mexico of African descent, and he calls him a barbarian of the southern coast, a vile freak of nature, a wild from a wild Indian woman and a savage African man. And you can't teach a contemporary Latin American course without including Jorge Luis Borges, right? And if you look at some of the things that he has expressed about Black folks, you can see his racist ideologies represented here as well. He calls Blacks unbearable, that America made a grave mistake in educating them, and as slaves, they were like children, they were happier, less annoying. And it's funny because I think back to my Spanish classroom, and like every good Spanish teacher in high school, I had posters of all types of people. I tried to have representation, so there were minoritized folks, but I also we read Borges, we studied Borges. I had pictures of Simón Bolívar in the class, and I never really questioned these. It was just kind of taken for granted that these were the heroes of the Spanish-speaking world. And when I was in Mexico, I spent a month there over the summer of last year on a Fulbright grant. A lot of the research dealing with racism there focuses on this idea of racism by means of omission, by means of erasure, as if Blacks don't exist. And so you'll hear things like, there aren't any Black people here, no hay negros aquí. And a lot of the key words in the research looks at how might we visibilizar a los negros, just making them visible, making that history visible. And you think about the impact that experience has on our students. One of my colleagues who also participated in that program last summer, she's currently an administrator at a post-secondary institution. And like many of our students, she took just a couple of Spanish classes in college and went on to not major in Spanish, but be connected to it in various ways because of her own interest. And this is what she says. She says, "I'm pretty pissed off that I didn't learn about Afro-Latin identities and cultures. Now, whose fault is that?" And there are two things that stick out to me. This idea about her being pissed off and just how upset and angry she was about that, and how I also felt, I remember feeling that, I could relate to that. And the part about whose fault is it? So it makes me think, okay, I can't tear down these institutions and rebuild them, but as an educator, what power do I have within the context of my classroom and the curriculum that I teach in order to address this? And then Kubota, Austin, and Saito Abba, they say that students often leave a foreign language class thinking that it's only about communication of basic personal needs or facts. And this view leaves out entirely the sociopolitical dimensions in which language and culture are intrinsically embedded. And I know that many of you are here because you believe that and you know that that's important. And so it's great that we can engage in these conversations and talk about specific concrete ways that we try to achieve that goal. I love when Gloria Latson-Billings talks about culturally relevant pedagogy. She says we teach what we value, and then Paris and Elam, they extend that when they talk about culturally sustaining pedagogies and say that we sustain what we love. And so my question for us is, as we think about our classes and the experiences that our students have, both in the content and the practices of what we incorporate in our classes, what does that say about the things that we value and the things that we choose to sustain and the things that we love? In this presentation, we'll talk a little bit about, taking anti-colonial approaches. And so I do want to quickly mention Tuck and Yang's critique of that term decolonization, how it's not a metaphor. And if you're really thinking about true decolonization for Indigenous people or for Black descendants of enslaved people, true decolonization at the societal level would be giving Indigenous people their land back. It would be giving reparations for Black folks who are descendants of enslaved people who have lost their land and their legacies due to the institution of slavery in our society. And we're not doing we're not doing that in our classes. So let's remember to keep that perspective as we're thinking about these terms like anti-racism and anti-colonial approaches, that what we're doing in the classroom is not real decolonization in the sense of it, but we can work towards and work alongside of movements within those communities. There are movements within those communities for repatriation of land and for reparations for ADOS populations, African descendants of enslaved people. And then I also want to comment that when I talk about anti-colonial and anti-racist, the reason that I like to group them together, because I don't like to create this us versus them type mentality of Blackness versus Indigenousness. I think that those experiences are connected, and those goals are connected, and those liberation movements are connected. And I always like to find someone more credible than I to who agrees with me. So Django Paris also talks about that when he's talking about liberation movements of Native people and Black people, and how all of these experiences are really connected to settler violence, and how part of what the Academy does is try to imagine those struggles as separate and competing, and how we as educators and as members of those communities and allies of those communities have to actively reject that narrative. So I want to talk about a couple of things that we can do. I think I have here curriculum, text selection, and then we'll look at some challenges, and then we'll have time for questions at the end here. So with curriculum development, I want to show you a number. This is the number 0. This number represents the number of times, if you look at the, let's see if I have it here. I'm in my office. I do not have it nearby, but I was going to pull up the World Readiness Standards for Language Learning, like the thick book, not just the 5 C's and explanations, but I'm talking about the 5 C's and all of the connected lessons and examples. This is the number of times that you'll see the word race in that entire document and in all of the examples. Sexuality, gender, unless you're talking about the gender of nouns and adjectives, discrimination. Even the word equality doesn't appear. Equity doesn't appear. Justice doesn't appear at all. And I say that to remind us that even though that 5 C's framework can be adapted to incorporate justice-oriented pedagogies, it's important to acknowledge the reality that it wasn't created from that framework, because that language is not embedded into the document itself. And so what I then have to do when I'm teaching my class and thinking about the content of my course is look at the resources that are available to me. So I'm talking about my textbook. In my college, we all have to use a common textbook for our lower level language courses. And so let's look at one of the chapters there. There's a chapter on narrating the past and discussing travel. And in the textbook, the themes are household chores, shopping, and air travel and lodging. And so students are talking about, did you sweep this morning? Did you vacuum this morning? Did you wash the dishes last night? That kind of thing. And so what I try to do is think about, okay, what modified contexts and themes can I incorporate in my class so that my students are still achieving those same language functions, which are useful. I think it's useful definitely to be able to narrate in the past. And how might I be able to create a new essential question? And so my essential question for this particular unit becomes, what are the motivations and outcomes of our life trajectories across geography and time? And that allows me to look at narrating in the past and discussing travel in the context of movement in our daily lives, the paths of our ancestors, immigrant rights, and family and community histories and traditions. And so those are the things that we focus on. And my students are still using vocabulary that's accessible to them, that's important to them, and they're still achieving those same language functions that they would have been achieving otherwise with these very bland contexts. And I have a quick example of that. Because I always like to show that this is something that can actually be implemented in the classroom. So this is Joe Arroyo's song Rebellion, which is what you saw when I opened up the presentation. And like I said, this presentation is shared with you, and you can click on the various links that I have included in here in order to access these resources. And you can see here a lot of the verb forms that he's using to talk about the past are high frequency verbs, like to be, to give, to live, to take, to rebel. So these are things that that students would come across anyway in looking at the context that are within the textbook. Another one is Me Gritaron Negra, which is a spoken word piece by Victoria Santa Cruz, who's Afro-Peruvian. And again, you see those high frequency verbs where she's talking about her experiences. And what I love about all of these pieces is that they tell the truth about the negative experiences that that these folks have gone through, but they also talk about ways that they have rebelled against those narratives and how it led to liberation eventually. And then a final example is a more traditional poem. So I started with a song, then I went to like more of a spoken word piece that has music with it. And now this one is a completely literary piece. But in the video, you can see an example of Nancy Morricone reading it. She's Afro-Cuban. And the title of this, if you don't speak Spanish, is called Black Woman. And again, you can see there the high frequency, not only of the structures, but also of words that students are learning otherwise, like to work, trabajar, to do or to make, hacer in Spanish. So these are the resources that I use with my students. And then just to give you one example of many activities that we do in class, one of my favorite ones is that I create a Padlet board and students compose a paragraph highlighting a time in their life in which they learned something from a negative, unpleasant, or difficult experience, and how that might have led to this newfound way of understanding that element of their identity, or led them to engage in liberation efforts related to that. And I also give them the support that they need to do that. Okay, so if you're talking about descriptions, Spanish has two past tenses, the imperfect and the preterite. So how might you, based on the examples that we saw in the songs, how might you talk about, how might you describe the way things were? How might you describe what happened? And then how might you talk about what the outcome was? With regard to text selection, and also when I talk about text, I mean, I use text in like the pedagogical term. So talking about written, they can be oral, they can be audiovisual. So it's not just, words, it can be images even. So anything can be a text, a film, a commercial, a song. It doesn't have to be like a poem or a short story or book or something like that. So this is a very recent study from Padilla and Vanna. They looked at textbooks in Spanish, and they found that the representation of Afro-Latinx folks was collectivized and personalized and really superficial. So nothing surprising, I don't think, but but you know, at least you know that it's not just in your head. You know, people who actually have gone out, I think there were 15 beginning level textbooks that they looked at for the study. This is what they found, and that the study also uncovered the erasure, the tourist gaze, stereotypes, and blatant issues of colorism when thinking about Black folks. And so the way that we combat this is to keep in mind, first of all, that representation is the absolute lowest bar. That's something that Uju and I say in that article. It's a necessary step, but if that can't be the only thing. I can't just incorporate things produced by and for minoritized folks. That really is the lowest bar. What I need to do is really take those texts, and again, text in a more general term, not just written text, and finding resources that present counterpoint and counter narratives, and making sure that I'm not oversimplifying the diversity or glossing over the controversy or the inequity that these texts address. And the cool thing about it is when you do that, you move from narratives of conquering, oppression, and victimhood to narratives of resistance, liberation, and joy, because that's what people are writing about. And that's sort of the natural path that this takes when that's what we choose to focus on. And I want to talk about two quick frameworks for engaging with resources. The first one is something that Uju and I mentioned in that article, reading Sims Bishop. This is very general, and at this point, common sense. You hear this analogy quite often now, and you know, this is decades old. But thinking of resources as a window where students can look out into other worlds and experiences, a mirror where they can see their own experiences validated and present in the curriculum, a sliding door where they can both literally and figuratively enter into the worlds of others. And we add to that, it should be a lens, so that we're looking at how does what I see when I look in my mirror affect the things that I experience when I go through that sliding door, realizing that those are not objective experiences, that they are different for everyone in our class. And so really focusing on how our identity impacts the way that we experience the resources that we come across in our class. And speaking of identity, I love Goldie Muhammad's culturally and historically responsive literacy framework that she outlines in her text, Cultivating Genius. And it has 5 parts to it. And here I have just sort of essential questions that I think relate to looking at these 5 elements in the language classroom. So with identity, thinking about how students make sense of who they and others are. Skills, how we help students develop that language proficiency, that's always important. What new and interesting knowledge will students acquire? And so I don't think it's always bad if you've seen me present, or if you talk to me before, I'm always critical of this sort of content, the culture as content approach. But I think the reason I criticize that is because I don't want us to just stop there. But I do think it's okay and it's fun and it can be enlightening to learn new things about cultures, to learn new facts about cultures, and to engage in sort of intellectual discovery. So I think that's great, as long as that's not the only thing that we do. We're not just looking at, you know, states and countries and capitals and that kind of thing. Criticality, helping students recognize and understand things of power, equity, and anti-oppression. And what I think is most important, joy. How do we help students celebrate the joy and beauty of themselves and others? Oh, sorry, I didn't click for both of them. I got carried away talking. And I want to focus on a couple of resources. First, I'll look at one that is outside of my particular language of study. This is a text from Japanese. And this is Naomi Osaka talking about her experience as a Black woman athlete. And she actually says here in this tweet, before she's a tennis player, before I'm an athlete, I'm a Black woman. And she talks about how that experience has shaped the way that she views her existence, both in the world of tennis and you know, society as a whole. And I think if we really unpack this, we can find evidence of all 5 of those elements that that I just talked about. How she talks about her identity. How can we help students develop their proficiency in the language by studying this? How can we help students be critical? And then how can this be seen as an act of resistance or joy by looking at this piece? And then I also have an example from my own class. This is a poem by Ariana Brown. I always want to say Ariana Grande. Her name is Ariana Brown. She's an Afro-Mexican poet. And she talks about her experience learning Spanish. And so I'm going to play this for us.
New ship. Dear white girls in my Spanish class, I see you. Stumbling so hard you laugh through entire sentences because my ancestors are a punchline and everything that comes out of your mouth is funny. Funny. Guess I'm used to being a joke, a brown body splayed and smoldering at the corner of your lip. I just want to know, when you hold the sacred sound on your tongue, do you feel less holy? Why are you here? I bet you thought this class would be easy, since Spanish is what poor brown people speak, right? Not something you actually have to try to understand, not fancy or sophisticated, not like French, the language you love overpronouncing as if compensating for your basic American whiteness. You are not special. You are the reason my grandmother feared her children would speak with accents. So afraid, she buried her first language in the space between blood and bone because your grandparents wouldn't let her make a home outside her body. Did your ancestors protect you from pain by withholding what they knew of a country before this one? Let me be clear. Spanish was given to my people at the end of a sword, forced in our throats gory, sharpened under the colonizer's constant eye. Each rolled R is a red, wet fingerprint pointing me back to this. Spanish is not my native tongue. English is not my native tongue. The languages I speak are bursting with blood, but they are all I have. I own only my hot mouth, speeding against assimilation's clock and a colonial legacy you won't even try to pronounce. So I'll ask again, why are you here? Do you think my grandmother's accent a sickness? One so volatile, you call yourself gringa at every chance, so I won't make fun of you when you make fun of the way my language sounds to you. Don't you know I had to fight for this? For each scrap of culture I could get my hands on, even if its lineage is as European as yours. My father, a Black American man, is descended from slaves. I'm not sure if you understand what that means. I am descended from slaves. I want to know where I come from, but I can only trace my history in one direction, so I am here in yet another Spanish class, desperately reaching for a language I hope will choose me back someday. What is it like to be a tourist in the halls of my shame, to not be expected to speak better than you do, to visit Mexico and not care that people mistake you for being from somewhere else? How does it feel to take a foreign language for fun, to owe your history nothing?
Okay, and that's a very powerful piece. And I show that I originally started using that in my composition course, which was mainly intermediate low learners. And then later I collaborated with a Spanish 101 educator to use that in an introductory Spanish course, like during the first week of class, thinking about, why are we here? Why are we learning this language? And how might my reasons for learning be very different from the people that I'm sitting beside? And how might that increase my critical language awareness about Spanish? And I couple that with this poem written by one of my students, actually, and published in a literary magazine. This is called Father Tongue. And in this, I'll just read this first stanza. She says, "In my head, Spanish is a language round and smooth, of rolling and gliding like a stone over frozen lake. Pero en mi boca, las palabras son jagged and flat, como vidrio, roto on my teeth, on my tongue. I was raised by these words extraños, by these words que no puedo hablar." And so she talks about that experience and how there's this conflict, right, of pride and shame in some context of related to the Spanish language. And at the very basic level, the kind of like the basic takeaway for a level 1 student is just to to be cognizant of that and to realize how we each experience language learning and how that might increase our awareness of how others engage with the language, and what can we do with that knowledge to be better allies, or to go through our lives as we go through our own language learning experience. And so some examples of what I have students do with that at the novice low level, I can recognize a few individual words in a poem. Looking at that poem from Victoria Gonzalez, you can ask them, what words do you recognize? Like, and they'll know words like abuelito or tío, maybe. Definitely some of the food words that she talks about, like frijoles negros, plátanos, etc. And I had them do like a linguistic landscape project where they look at places within their own communities where Spanish is used. So as they go about their own daily lives, they just exist in their communities. Where might they come across Spanish? I wish that I would have done that in my language classroom, because like I said, there was Spanish all around me, but I just never, I never made that connection. It always seemed very foreign for some reason. And at that novice low level, we also asked them to create just a very simple graphic organizer representing reasons why they are in the class and reasons why the people who produce these works might be in a Spanish 1 class. Because that's another way that we stereotype heritage speakers of the language. It's like, why are you here? Well, one of the subtitles of one of my papers was, I was quoting a student who was like, why is Jose in here? He's fluent, right? And realizing that there is a very nuanced relationship that many people have with the language. And so that is why they are in those classes alongside you, learning. They have, in some cases, very similar reasons. It's not a monolithic population, but in many cases, they have very different reasons from you for being in that class. And so you can see there some of the critical reflection elements that we have students do. In the Spanish composition class, we talk about those things in Spanish, and then at the lower levels, we have a conversation in English about that. How might these pieces be considered acts of resistance? And then in their own lives and in their own interactions, how might we push back against dominant language ideologies that are really rooted in colonialism and racism? I have here some ideas of where to find resources. So if you're thinking, oh, I want to incorporate some more of these resources in my class, I'm not going to find these types of things in the textbook or in the readily available curricular resources. Where might I access them? Here are just some examples. Like I love tweets, I love Instagram posts, I love blogs written by community members, because it also shows you what those communities are talking about and what types of political engagement they're involved with. If you go to Twitter and you see sort of what's trending, or if you go to Instagram and you look at the trending posts, professional groups like ACFLSIGs or Facebook groups, student created resources. Many of our students are already thinking about these things, and like the example that I just showed you from Victoria, media outlets, and then our own research, thinking about how are we ourselves consuming the perspectives of marginalized communities. And then really quickly, I want to talk about community and the importance of thinking about community as we engage in anti-racist and anti-colonial pedagogies. I have here just some examples of ways that communities all around the world are engaging in activism surrounding issues that are important to ourselves and to the students that are in our class. So Stop Asian Hate rally in Chicago, Black Lives Matter rally in Brazil, in South Korea, a Black Lives Matter rally. It's not something that's unique to our community or our region or our nation. LGBT rights in France, environmental justice protests in Germany. And these are Ukrainians in Japan protesting the war in Ukraine. So again, these topics and these issues are not limited to geographic region. People all over the world are engaged in this. And one thing that I try to do in my classes, one example of that is thinking about, how are people engaged in our own communities and how can I bring that into the classroom? And so if you know anything about the history of Wilmington, in 1898, we had a race massacre that happened in our community, and it was the only successful coup d'etat in American history, where the Black and multiracial elected government was overthrown by the angry white mob of the community at the time. And so Black businesses, Black communities just lost their legacies and their lives in just a few days. And so this is connected. This experience that happened here in 1898 is connected to what goes on today in our community. These are just some headlines from the past couple of years of what's happening in Wilmington, where I live. So long history of racial injustice. Yes, I was born here, by the way, and I didn't learn about the massacre of 1898 until I was like in graduate school. It's just not something that you talk about, even though streets are named after that. There are monuments that people who were conspirators in that. There are parks named after people who were involved in that. And it's just so interesting that we completely erased this element of our history until recently, even to the point of censuring our chancellor for his lack of empathy for racial justice in our community. And so here is an example of how I try to bring that into the classroom. We try to talk about like the Black Lives Matter movement and how that is being carried out in our community and also in Spanish-speaking communities, both locally and around the world. And so those first two photos are photos that I took on campus. We recently erected an artistic monument to honor the massacre of 1898. And then you'll see these banners all around campus about Black Lives Matter, silence equals violence. And so we try to unpack that. What does it mean to be silent? Do you agree with that? What does that look like in the context that we exist? And again, giving the students the vocabulary to be able to discuss these things in Spanish, even at a low level. And I have here a link that you can click if you're interested in more resources related to that. And I also threw this in just because it was something that was on my mind, thinking about community activism. This is community activism in the town of Coyolill in the state of Veracruz in Mexico. And it's just a good example of Goldie Muhammad's framework of looking at criticality and connecting that to joy. The person in this video, Daniela, she's talking about ways that she experiences pride in her community and also ways that she and other people, mainly Black women in their community, are working towards justice-oriented initiatives. And so there's a lot that you can do with that. And I have here a link to a slideshow that includes videos and pictures that I took during my time in Coyolill as well. And
Hola, ¿qué tal?
I'll watch it. But some of the challenge, I want to end by talking about some of the challenges that I know we all experience. And there's been research on this, fear of potential backlash, lack of support of colleagues, pushback from students, and then lack of developmentally and linguistically appropriate curricular resources, in particular when we're trying to develop students' language proficiency, in addition to incorporating some of these heavy themes. And I've experienced all of this, and I get that. And I think it's important that we openly recognize that this is difficult, and that, in many contexts, people do experience pushback, and they are hesitant to incorporate some of these things. And so that's why I think that community is so important, and collaboration is important for us to sort of work through some of these challenges together. You may have seen this being circulated by opponents of critical race theory. And it just gives you an idea of when people say critical race theory, what they actually mean. Really, it's anything that relates to identity or race or criticality. And that's not what critical race theory is. I mean, those of us who have actually done work in it know that it's a legal term that mainly describes legal discrimination. But but I think the term is scary enough. We've seen it. It's scary enough that when you say it, it's like, ooh, I don't want that in my class kind of thing. And so all of these things sort of get grouped into that. And again, I've seen evidence of that. These are headlines from the K through 12 schools in my community in Brunswick and New Hanover County, which is where I live currently in North Carolina. And just, I mean, looking at some of these headlines, it's mind-boggling. Like, how can you oppose rights, like that third one there about transgender rights, opposing transgender rights? How do you actively oppose the rights of a group if you're on the school board? And so it's just a really challenging place to be in. And also in our classroom, critical moments can arise that threaten teaching and learning, and they can occur when people are very passionate about these types of ideas, and dynamics in the classroom can kind of go off the rails every now and then. And I want to end by just talking about some specific ways that in my own class, I have tried to address this. So one is via a syllabus statement. I know you can't read that, it's really small text, but again, you have access to the presentation. But my goals of that syllabus statement are the following. I try to openly and honestly acknowledge the politicized nature of language learning, let my students know that I'm going to take an intentional anti-colonial, anti-racist approach. I explain the rationale for the topics and the resources that we're going to be using. I help students feel sort of comfortable with the discomfort that we're going to experience. I express reasons and expectations for when we'll use English to engage in some of those deep discussions at certain points. And then I let them know that I too am willing to engage in self-reflection along with them. Other ongoing strategies, reminding students of that framework throughout the semester, and not just at the beginning of the term, incorporating those low stakes, no stakes team building activities throughout the entire semester, and encouraging relationships and trust building through consistent small groups. And I do want to remind everyone that we do lots of superficial fun stuff in my class. It's not all deep conversations about race and justice every class. We do plenty of superficial things. There's plenty of space for students to have fun and to not just engage cognitively at that level all the time, right? And one of the things that I like to do within those consistent small groups is to establish norms for healthy dialogue and try to be proactive when I'm going to engage in these types of discussions. And one way that I do that is through the Courageous Conversations framework. So help us to think about how can we stay engaged, speak our truth, experience discomfort, and expect and accept non-closure, knowing that we're not going to solve these issues in the course of a few moments. And so kind of the takeaway as you think about incorporating this work is to think big, start small, and go for an early win. So don't try to, change your entire curriculum. Don't overwhelm yourself. Think about what's one activity, what's one point of entry, what's one way I can bring in a perspective that I hadn't brought in before, and how can I embed it into what I already do in the classroom. And I'm going to end there, and I think we have 5 minutes. I realize that a lot of people have things that start at 3 o'clock, so I see people kind of logging out.
Yes.
But thank you for your engagement, and thank you for, I have the pictures up. I see all of you, so I'm seeing the head nods and I'm seeing the reactions. So I just want you to know that I appreciate that. So thank you for your engagement and for the invitation. And yeah, so we have a few minutes if you have a question, a recommendation, reflection, or a next step.
Yes, LG, those were the sounds you were hearing, folks going off to teach.
Yeah.
But we have some folks here, they're still connected. I
was like, people don't want to talk about community. Everyone's leaving during the community.
That's where I draw the line when he mentions community. Yeah. So I can read questions from the chat if folks rather do that, or if you want to use the raise your hand function, I can pull up and see who has their hand raised. So go ahead, Lujan.
I was muted, sorry. Oh my God, so many things to process. First, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to listen to you, to be witness of your generosity, because you're sharing so much with us, and you're like, in my personal level jump starting her passion, because it's always like somewhat tiring to keep like pushing this agenda and keep pushing this thing. So thank you. Now for my question. You mentioned something about small consistency, small groups or something like that. Can you expand a little bit on that?
Definitely. So I do this when I'm going to stop sharing just so that we can see each other's faces more clearly, by the way.
Oh, no.
So, I teach online asynchronously now, so it's super important. And what I do is I have my students work with the same group for, if it's during the summer for the whole session, if it's during the year for half the year. And so anytime we do a group activity, they go to those same groups, and that's where they unpack. When they do a discussion board or something like that, it's always that same group of like 8 to 10 people. And so that creates space for trust, for forgiveness if someone says the wrong thing, because you have those relationships. And I just found, especially for the online class, that's crucial. But I do that in my face-to-face classes as well. Like for like a month, we all work together with that same small group so that you build those relationships, because that's the most important thing when you're doing like a potentially polemic topic, or